All right, we are on chapter 2 of Prince Caspian. So remember, Peter, Lucy, Susan, and Edmund just found themselves, they think back in Narnia, but they're not sure. And they just found an old abandoned wall that they're standing in while they are stuck on this island. So we're going to find out what happens next in the story. So this wasn't a garden, said Susan. It was a castle, and this must have been the courtyard. I see what you mean. Yes, that is the remains of a tower, and there is what used to be a flight of steps going up to the top of the walls. And look at those other steps, the broad, shallow ones, going up to the doorway. That must have been going indoor to the great hall. Ages ago, by the look of it, said Edmund. Yes, ages ago. I wish we could find out who the people were that lived in this castle, and how long ago. It gives me a very odd feeling, said Lucy. Does it, Lou? Said Peter, turning and looking at her. Because it does the same to me. It's the oddest thing that's happened in this odd day. I wonder where we are and what it all means. While they were talking, they had crossed the courtyard and gone through the other doorway into what had once been the hall. It was now very much like the courtyard, for the roof had long since disappeared, and it was merely another space of grass and daisies, except it was shorter, narrower, and the walls were higher. Across the far end there was a kind of terrace about 3 feet higher than the rest. I wonder, was it really a hall? Asked Susan. What kind of terrace? What is this terrace kind of thing? Why, you silly, said Peter, who had become strangely excited. Don't you see? That's the dais where the high table was, where the king and the great lords sat. Anyone would think that you would have forgotten that we ourselves were once kings and queens and sat on a dais just like that in our great hall. In our castle of Caerparavel, continued Susan, in a dreamy, rather sing-song voice, at the mouth of the great river in Narnia. How could I forget? How it all comes back. We could pretend we are in Caerparavel now. This hall must have been very much like the great hall we feasted in. Unfortunately, without the feast, said Edmund. It's getting late, you know. Look how the shadows are long. Have you noticed that it isn't so hot? We will need a campfire if we've got to spend the night here, said Peter. I've got matches. Let's go see if we can collect some dry wood. Everyone saw the sense of this, and for the next half hour they were busy. The orchard through which they had first come to the ruins turned out not to be a good place for firewood. They tried the other side of the castle, passing out of the hall by a little side door into the maze of stony humps and hollows, which once must have been passages and smaller rooms, but was now nettles and wild roses. Beyond this they found a wide gap in the castle wall, and stepped through it into a wood of darker, bigger trees, where they found dead branches, rotten wood, and sticks, dry leaves and fir cones in plenty. They went to and fro with bundles until they had a good pile on the day. On the fifth journey they found the well just outside the hall, hidden in weeds, but clean and fresh and deep when they had cleared these away. The remains of a stove pavement ran halfway around it. Then the girls went to pick some more apples, and the boys built the fire, on the day and fairly close to the corner between the two walls, which they thought would be the snuggest and warmest place. Today they had difficulty in lighting it, and used a lot of matches, but they succeeded in the end. Finally, all four sat down with their backs to the wall and their faces to the fire. They tried roasting some apples on the ends of sticks, but roasted apples are not much good without sugar, and they're too hot to eat with your fingers until they're too cold to be worth eating. So they had to content themselves with raw apples, which, as Edmund said, made them realize the school suppers weren't so bad after all. I wouldn't mind a good slice of bread and margarine this minute, he added, but the spirit of adventure was rising in all of them, and no one really wanted to be back at school. Shortly after the last apple had been eaten, Susan went out to the well to get another drink. When she came back, she was carrying something in her hand. Look, she said in a rather choking kind of voice. I found it by the well. Peter sat down. She handed it to Peter and sat down. The others looked, and she sounded like she were going to cry. Edmund and Lucy eagerly bent forward to see what was in Peter's hand. A little bright thing that gleamed in the firelight. Well, I'm confused, said Peter, and his voice also sounded odd. Then he handed it to the others, and all now saw what it was. A little chestnut, ordinary in size but extraordinarily heavy because it was made of pure gold, and the eyes in the horse's head were two little tiny rubies, or rather one was, for the others had been knocked out. Why, said Lucy, it's exactly like one of the golden chessmen we used to play with when we were kings and queens at Caerparavel. Cheer up, Sue, Peter said to his older sister. I can't help it. It brought back so many lovely times. I remember playing chess with fauns and good giants, more people singing, and my beautiful horse, and now, said Peter in quite a different type of voice, it's time we four started using our brains. What about? Said Edmund. Have none of you guessed where we are? Said Peter. Go on, said Lucy. I've felt for hours there was something wonderful mystery about hanging over this place. Fire ahead, Peter, said Edmund. We're all listening. We're in the ruins of Caerparavel itself, said Peter. But, I mean, But how do you figure that? Said Edmund. This place has been ruined for ages. Look at those big trees growing right up to the gates. Look at the very stones. Anyone could see that nobody's lived here for hundreds of years. I know, that is the difficulty, but let's leave that out for the moment. I want to take points one by one. First point, this hall is exactly the same shape and size as the hall of Car Paravel. Just picture a roof on this, a colored pavement instead of grass, tapestries on the walls, and get out a royal banqueting hall. No one said anything. Second, the castle well is exactly where our well was, a little to the south of the great hall and exactly the same size and shape. Again, no one said anything. Third point, Susan has just found one of our old chessmen, something like that of them as two peas. Still, nobody answered. Fourth point, don't you remember it was the very day before the ambassadors came from the King of Calormen? Don't you remember planting the orchard outside the north gate at Car Paravel? The greatest of all the wood people, Pomea herself, came to put good spells on it. It was those very decent little chaps and moles who did the actual digging. Can you have forgotten the funny little old lily gloves, the chief mole, leaning on his spade, saying, "Believe me, your majesty, you'll be glad of these fruit trees one day." And goodness, he was right. I do, said Lucy, clapping her hands. But look here, Peter, said Edmund. This is all crazy. To begin with, we didn't plant the orchard slap up against the gate. We wouldn't have been that stupid. No, of course not, said Peter, but it has grown up to the gate since. And for another thing, Carpelville wasn't an island. Yes, I've been wondering about that, but it was what do you call it? A peninsula. Jolly near an island. Couldn't have been made an island since our time. Somebody has dug a channel. But hold on, you keep saying since our time, but it's only a year since we came back to Narnia. And you made out that in one year, castles have fallen down, great forests have grown up, and little trees we planted ourselves turned into big apple orchard, and goodness knows what else. It's impossible. There's one thing. If there is Carparavel, there ought to be a door at the end of this day. In fact, we ought to be sitting with our backs against it this moment. You know, the door that led down to the treasure chamber. I suppose there isn't a door, Peter said, getting up. The wall was behind a mass of ivory. We can find out, said Edmund, taking up one of the sticks they had laid ready for putting on the fire. He began beating the ivy. Tap, tap, went the stick against the stone. Tap, tap, went again. And then all of a sudden, boom, boom, a quite different sound, a hollow wooden sound. Great Scott, said Edmund. We must clear this ivy away, said Peter. Oh, let's leave it alone. We can try it in the morning. If we've got to spend the night here, I don't want an open door at my back and a great black hole of anything that might come out of it. Besides, the draft and the damp. It'll soon be dark. Oh, Susan, how can you? Said Lucy with a reproachful glance. Both the boys were too much excited to take any notice of Susan's advice. They worked at the ivies with their hands and Peter's pocket knife until the knife broke. After that, they used Edmund's. Soon the whole place they had been sitting was covered with ivy, and at last the door was cleared. Locked, of course, said Peter, but the wood's all rotten. We can pull it to bits in no time. We'll make extra firewood. Come on. It took them longer than expected, and before they were done, the great hall had grown dusky, and the first star or two had come out overhead. Susan was not the only one who felt a slight shudder as the boys stood above the pile of splinting woods, rubbing dirt in their hands, and staring at the cold, dark opening they had made. Now for a torch. Oh, what is the good? Said Susan. And as Edmund said, I'm not saying it now, Edmund interrupted. I still don't understand, but we can settle that later. I suppose you're coming down, Peter? We must. Cheer up, Susan. It's no good behaving like kids now that we are back in Narnia. You're a queen here. Anyway, no one could go to sleep with a mystery like this on our minds. They tried to use long sticks for torches, but it was not a success. If you held them up with the lighted end, they went out. And if you held them the other way, they scorched your hand and the smoke got in your eyes. In the end, they had to use Edmund's electric torch or flashlight. Luckily, it had been a birthday present less than a week ago, and the battery was almost new. He went first with the light, then came Lucy, then Susan, and Peter brought up the back. I've come to the top of the steps. Count them, said Peter. 1, 2, 3, Edmund said on the bottom as he went cautiously down, up to 16. And this is the bottom. Then it really must be Carparavel, said Lucy. There were 16. Nothing more was said until all were standing in a knot together at the foot of the stairway, and then Edmund flashed his flashlight slowly around. Oh, all four of the children said at once. For now they all knew indeed that it was the ancient treasure chamber of Carparavel, where they had once reigned as kings and queens of Narnia. It was kind of a path up the middle, as it might be in a greenhouse. Along each side, intervals, stood rich suits of armor, knights guarding treasures. In between the suits of armor On each side was a path where shelves covered precious things, necklaces and arm rings, finger rings, golden bowls, dishes, long tusks of ivory, brooches, coronets, the chains of gold, heaps of unset stones lying piled anyhow as if they were marbles or potatoes, diamonds, rubies, carbuncles, emeralds, topazes, and amethysts. Under the shelves stood a great chest of oak, and strengthened with iron bars and heavily padlocked. It was bitterly cold, so they could still hear themselves breathing, and the treasures were covered with dust, that unless they had realized where they were and remembered most of the things, they would have hardly known what the treasures were. There was something sad and a little frightening about the place, because it all seems forsaken so long ago, and that's why nobody said anything for at least a minute. Then, of course, they began walking around and picking things up to look at. It was like meeting very old friends. If you had been there, you would have heard things like, "Oh, look, our coronation rings. Do you remember first wearing this? Why, this is the little brooch we thought was us. I say, isn't the army you wore in the great tournament of the Lone Islands? Or do you remember a dwarf making for this? Or do you remember drinking out of that horn? Or do you remember? But suddenly Edmund said, "Look here, we mustn't waste the battery. Goodness knows how often we'll need it. Hadn't we better take out what we want and get out again?" "We must take the gifts," said Peter. For long ago at Christmas in Narnia, he, Susan, and Lucy had been given certain presents which they valued more than their whole kingdom. Edmund had no gift because he was not with them at the time. This was his own fault, and you can read about it in the other book. They all agreed with Peter, and walked up to the path at the wall at the far end of the treasure chamber, and there, sure enough, were the gifts still hanging. Lucy's was the smallest, for it was only a little bottle, but the bottle was made of diamond instead of glass, and it was still more than halfway full of the magical cordial, which would heal almost every wound and every illness. Lucy said nothing and looked very serious as she took the gift down from its place, slung the belt over her shoulder once more, and felt the bottle at her side where it used to hang in the old days. Susan's gift had been a bow, an arrow, and a horn. The bow was still there, and the ivory quiver full of well-feathered arrows. But, oh, Susan, where's the horn? Oh, bother, bother, I remember it now. I took it with me the last day of all, when we went hunting the white stag. It must have gotten lost when we blundered back into that other place. England, I mean. Edmund whistled. It was indeed shattering loss, for this was an enchanted horn, and whenever you blew it, it was certain that help would come to you wherever you were. "Just the sort of thing that might have come in handy in a place like this," said Edmund. "Never mind, we've still got the bow," and she took it. "Won't the string be perished?" said Susan, asked Peter. Whether by some magic, or the air in the treasure chamber, or not, the bow was still in working order. Archery and swimming were the things Susan was good at, and in a moment she bent the bow, and she gave one little pluck to the string. It twanged in a chirping twang that vibrated the whole room, and the one small noise brought back the old days to the children's mind more than anything that had happened yet. All the battles and hunts and feasts came rushing into their heads together, and then she unstrung the bow again and slung the quiver at her side. Next Peter took down his gift, a shield and the great red lion on it, and the royal sword. He blew, tapped on the floor to get off all the dust. He fitted the shield on his arm and slung the sword by his side. He was afraid at first that it might be rusty and stick to the sheath, but it was not so. With one swift motion he drew it and held it up, shining in the torchlight. "This is my sword, Renaudon. With it I killed the wolf." And there was a new tone in his voice. The others all felt that he was really Peter, the High King again, and after a little pause everyone remembered they must save the battery. They climbed up the stair again, made up for the good fire, and lay down close together for warmth. The ground was very hard and uncomfortable, but they fell asleep in the end.